Навршува точно 3 години откако почна жестоката војна во Украина, во која досега загина и се повредени огромен број цивили. Доаѓањето на власт на американскиот претседател Доналд Трамп ја промени состојбата на преговарачката маса. Седна да преговара прво со Русија, нешто што досега не беше случај и се чини дека ги забрза работите за ставање крај на војната. Дали тоа ќе се случи и дали двајцата претседатели, украинскиот Володомир Зеленски и рускиот Владимир Путин ќе седнат на иста преговарачка маса, останува да видиме во наредните денови или недели. Добре дојдовте во уште еден лавиринт, јас сум Кристинатовска. По најавата слушнавте дека овој лавиринт ќе го посветиме на војната во Украина, токму поради тоа што во понеделник навршуваат точно 3 години од почетокот на оваа војна која направи тектонски промени на европско тло. Донесе економска криза, донесе многу расправи и поделби внатре во Унијата, а сега во оваа 2025 точно на 3 годишнината од почетокот на оваа војна се соочуваме, светот се соочува и со една нова состојба или една нова реалност по доаѓањето на десницата и во Соединетите американски држави, но и во поголемиот дел од Европа, односно од европскиот континент. Председателот, украинскиот председател Зеленски е малку притиснати од него, се бара и се очекува да исполни неколку работи кои ги побара американскиот председател Доналд Трамп, меѓу другото и пристап до ретките минерали. За тоа како размислуваат украинците и како гледаат на ова барање со оглед на фактот дека 3 години се трпител на оваа жестока и крвава војна, разговарам со Олена Халушка, активист, но и основач, односно ко-основач на Меѓународен центар за украинска победа, кој во изминативе 2 години се занимаваше со прашањето на замрзнатите руски средства и нивно потенцијално давање на користење на Украина. Од овде од студиото на медијата во Скопје одиме во Киев, разговараме со Олена Халушка. Miss Olena Halushka, thank you very much for accepting this interview. You're calling from Kiev, and in a few days we will mark 3 years since the beginning of this bloody war in Ukraine. So we all thought that all of this will end up much earlier, but here we are 3 years later. And first of all, I have to ask you, what is the current situation in Kiev and in whole Ukraine?
So first of all, thank you very much for having me here. Indeed, in 3 days, we will have a 3-year anniversary of the full-scale war, but we also have to be mindful that actually yesterday was the 11th anniversary of the Russian aggression against Ukraine that started on the 20th of February 2014 with Russia invading Crimea and then starting the bloody war and occupation of parts of Donetsk and Luhansk regions. So for us, indeed, the last 3 years, this war scaled up to the all-Ukrainian genocide, with Russia trying to destroy our energy system, targeting civilians. And just over the last 2 days, we have witnessed Russian bloody attacks against Odessa, targeting energy system, against Mykolaiv. They destroyed thermal power plant and left tens of thousands of Ukrainians without electricity and heating, while the temperatures are below zero right now. Yesterday, there was the massive glide bomb attack against Kherson. Kharkiv is constantly under attacks. Well, I'm currently in Kyiv, and I have to tell you that over the last week, we are having air raids and drone attacks and occasionally missiles against Kyiv literally every night. So when you're going to bed, roughly at 9 or 10 p.m., the air raid alert goes on, and you are permanently hearing the sounds of the air defenses working or even Shahed drones passing by. And I have to tell you that, of course, this is also part of the Russian terrorization campaign, because from the very start, they intended to subjugate Ukrainian people and to make us capitulate. And they thought that if they terrorize Ukrainian civilians very harshly, and that's basically, the same pattern as they shot down civilians who tried to evacuate from the occupation. We've seen that in the Kyiv region, we've seen that in the south and in the east, when unarmed civilians in the cars with big signs, children, were simply, shot down from the very close distance, meaning that, Russians realized whom they are shooting at. But that is all the pattern, trying to scare Ukrainian civilians to kind of get them, put the pressure at Zelensky to capitulate. But this is not an issue. I mean, we've been fighting for 11 years of the war, 3 years of the full-scale war. And honestly, why would we give up today when we know that Russia is not invincible, when we know that Russia created this myth of being the second best army in the world, but, it can hardly take the Donetsk region, as Putin put this as the interim goal of their conquest. Meaning that what we are trying to explain to our Western partners now is, don't be afraid of Russia. Russia created this myth of them being unbreakable, but in practice, this is not true.
So, Ms. Halushka, let's talk about today, about the new reality in which we woke up in this 2025, because everything was different last year for Ukraine and for the global politics. So the new president of United States of America is a little bit turning the situation. So we have new moments, and he wants to negotiate with Putin, but he had some intents to leave Ukraine aside and first negotiate directly with Russia. So what is your opinion about all of this? And it's not just Ukraine, but also European Union was left aside.
Well, you're absolutely right that there can be no peace in Europe without Europe and Ukraine being at the negotiations table discussing the future, because this is about our continent. And I think that Russians made it very clear from the very start that their ambition goes far beyond Ukraine. They want to restore the Russian Empire at the minimum. And we know that, some of the countries that were occupied into the Russian Empire are today members of NATO, meaning that the direct confrontation between Russia and NATO would be inevitable if this war, if Russian aggression is not stopped, if Russia is not defeated in Ukraine. And unfortunately, at this point, we see that the new administration might think that they can achieve the negotiated peace that will be beneficial both for Ukraine and Europe, but we still do not know what will be the outcome because
of the demands. So he asked from Ukrainian President Zelensky to actually give him approach and give him some rare minerals on Ukrainian soil, and Ukrainian President denied that. So what is opinion in Ukraine, since since you heard this news. Do you agree with President Zelensky?
Well, overall, I think we have to split this issue into two topics. First one is the rare minerals idea as the whole, and I personally fully support it, because I think that having American presence, strong American business presence and investors in Ukraine would be part of the security guarantees, long-term ones, because we have witnessed very well that since the start of the full-scale war, Western businesses that remained in Russia were strongly lobbying against strong sanctions on Russia, against, embargo and a full trade cut off, particularly because they were benefiting from being in Russia and didn't want to lose access to those markets. So overall, I think that, and what I'm hearing from other people in Ukraine, that we are fine, having American companies investing into Ukrainian rare materials. But what regards this very specific deal, I mean, what was leaked in media made very clear that there were no security guarantees, real strong security guarantees for Ukraine. And the part on American assurances and guarantees was very vague, while the part on what Ukraine needs to do seemed to be pretty clear and pretty strong. And I think that we in Ukraine already have the experience of the Budapest Memorandum, where it was very clear what Ukraine needs to do, give up on nuclear weapons, and the part of the guarantees coming from partners was very vague, and it was never actually implemented properly. So with this regard, I think that this draft deal needs to be revised. It needs to include specific, concrete security guarantees, guarantees for the military assistance, and so on and so forth. And in that case, it would be much more supported in Ukraine and more chances for it to be signed and fully implemented.
So Ukrainians and Ukrainian government doesn't have issues with the rare minerals, but with security guarantees, as I understood. So do you expect this deal to be signed after maybe these security guarantees are put inside?
Well, I hope so. That's what President Trump said yesterday, I guess, that there will be the second round of negotiations on this deal, and I hope that it will have more meaningful offers on the American part and American long-term support for Ukraine.
And what if President Zelensky doesn't agree with these terms again?
Well, let's see. Let's see, how the things evolve and develop.
Okay, I have one more question about the American president, and then we will switch to Europe maybe a little bit. The American president has really hard rhetorics. Speaking of Ukrainian President Zelensky, he even called him a dictator in this past few years. So what was the public opinion? What was the first reaction in Ukraine when you heard these words?
Well, that's a very interesting situation, because overall Ukrainian society and Ukrainian population are pretty critical of President Zelensky. I mean, I'm personally myself an anti-corruption activist, and we are regularly criticizing government and watchdogging them when we see that the reforms are not properly done, or if there are any roadblocks. But Zelensky is not a dictator. Zelensky is an elected president at the fair elections in 2019, and he won the landslide victory back then. I wasn't his voter, but of course I fully respect the choice that was made by the Ukrainian society. And right now, I mean, we have to continue repeating and explaining that we cannot hold elections right now during martial law. This is not because we do not want the elections to happen. This is because, first, elections are prohibited by the Ukrainian constitution. Second, you cannot hold real, true, transparent, and fair elections during the wartime. Why? How do you ensure that soldiers can run if they want, to go to the parliament or to run for the president? How can you ensure that
the opposition will get the space to represent their program in front of the citizens? So there is this issue with the election is much bigger, and that's exactly what I wanted to ask, because during the martial law it's not possible to even organize the election, and that won't be fair and democratic elections. So I guess elections are out of options until the end of the war.
I mean, yes, absolutely. You have probably you probably remember that Russians attacked a funeral in the Hroza village that was not far from the front lines. And, they are using these terrorist tactics very widely, and nothing will actually stop them attacking a couple of polling stations, on the elections day. And that will basically, fully break the turnout of the people. So we have to understand that without peace, sustainable, lasting peace, and real security guarantees that Russia will not disrupt our elections, because, we have seen how Russians tried to meddle and intervene in the Moldovan elections. They succeeded to do this in Georgia, Romanian presidential elections. We need to be mindful that Russia will try to use, even after the war ends, various hybrid tactics in order to try to install their government into Ukraine. So, of course, this is very challenging, and Ukraine is the real democracy. For the Ukrainian society, elections is a very important part of the democratic process, but at this very point, it's impossible to implement them.
Ms. Halushka, you have close relations with people in Washington, with your organization. You visited Washington, you talk with people in Congress, in the White House about the situation in Ukraine, mostly about returning or freezing the Russian assets and giving them to Ukraine. But first of all, I would like to ask, what is the opinion of the people you met in Washington about their president and his ideas and politics towards Ukraine?
Well, people are, of course, watching how the situation will develop. And I have a feeling that at this point, a lot of them are mostly in the watching mode.
So what do you think about European Union and this attempt to leave EU behind? And of course, this war is on European soil, so maybe European Union, along with Ukraine, should be the first one on the table.
Well, I fully agree with you. And I think, President Trump made a statement that we have a very beautiful ocean between us and this war. And that is actually something we have repeated to the European partners since 2022, basically since 2014, when we saw Minsk 1, Minsk 2, the attempts to settle this war with the diplomatic means, which completely failed because Russia never stuck to Minsk agreements. They always violated ceasefire and always blamed Ukraine for the violation. So this is also the trick which we need to keep in mind, that even if there is some kind of peace deal achieved, Russia will definitely try to violate it and accuse Ukraine in doing this. So we have to be mindful of their tactics and what they are doing. But coming back to the European Union, we have to also recognize two important things. First, it is unfair to underestimate the support which Ukraine has received from Europe. And I mean not only European Union, but Europe as the whole, with the UK, with Norway, with Balkan countries. And I mean, we are very grateful for that. And it is absolutely unfair to say that, you know, Europe are free riders. Everything is done on the American funds. Because, I mean, the figures say that the part of the European Union is even a little bit higher than the American, but that mostly regards, you know, budgetary funds, while American aid was mostly focused on the military support because they have much, of course, better and more advanced military capacities. But, I mean, this war is on Europe's continent. And Russia made it very clear that they want to grab as much territories as possible. And I made a comparison, I used the comparison made by Timothy Snyder at the Leonard Mary conference last year, when somebody asked him, comparing to World War II, where do you think we are now? And he said that it's 1938. In case if Czechoslovakia decided to fight back, to resist, and if the Allies supported them, because then we would have had war, but this wouldn't have been World War II. And he made a very important point that after Nazi Germany occupied Czechoslovakia, they used Czech military technologies and Czech military industry. They used Slovak soldiers, and they used much more favorable geographical position of those countries for their future wars of conquest. And this is something which we are trying to explain to our European partners, that in case if Russia is allowed to win in Ukraine, this is not only about, you know, losing a beautiful democratic country to the Russian dictatorship, but this means that, you know, after the purge and after genocide and after destruction of all of the resistance inside Ukraine, Russia would actually mobilize Ukrainian manpower, Ukrainian resources, and we know that Ukraine has very good rare minerals, you know, and other natural resources President Trump speaks about, and use Ukrainian geographical position in order to further attack European countries. So do not let Russia win in Ukraine, because this is not, you know, highly likely. This is 100% opening the doors to the much larger war and conquest on Europe's soil, and we want to prevent it. Let's have Russia defeated in Ukraine.
What is your assessment about the territory? Because we speak about victory and losing, and at this moment they have occupied a large part of Ukraine. And at this point, they don't want to return it back. So what is victory for Ukrainians? And is a deal possible without gaining back all the occupied territories at the moment?
Well, we have to understand that there will be no lasting peace in Europe if we do not have the sovereignty of Ukraine, Georgia, Moldova, and all of the countries that are occupied by Russia fully restored, meaning that any peace deal, you know, which would foresee rewarding Russia with the territories they have occupied, means just a break into a much larger war, because unpunished evil always grows and unpunished evil always returns back. I mean, what we are seeing today in Ukraine is a very direct consequence of impunity, which Russia enjoyed after two Chechen wars in 1990s, after invasion of Georgia, after 2014 Crimea and Donetsk and Luhansk oblasts, after horrible crimes in Syria, where Russia actually blurred the line and normalized horrible atrocities, you know, making them a kind of an everyday reality, not newsworthy anymore. And right now, today, we are witnessing 3 years of genocide, and unfortunately, there is no appetite to help Ukraine defeat Russia and bring justice finally, meaning that the war criminals should be tried in the international courts and they should be brought to account. And that also includes the highest leadership of Russia. And on one hand, we are presently seeing good dynamics happening in the Council of Europe, with the core group finalizing the negotiations about the establishment of the Tribunal for Russian Aggression. Hopefully that could be moved forward and it won't be suspended even in case if there is any peace negotiations happening. But we have to realize that overall, if Russia is not defeated, it will always pose the threat to the democratic and sovereign states of Europe.
So after Mr. Trump was elected, Europe in a way woke up. So now in these past few weeks, we saw more actions of the European Union concerning Ukraine, another sanctions for Russia, another package of help for Ukraine. But is that enough in this moment? And what else can European Union do in this moment to maybe help Ukraine and ease the talks?
I think that the main point right now here should be to protect and save American support for Ukraine. And I think that Europe stepping up and offering a lot of new solutions would basically contribute and advance to help keep American aid for Ukraine, because some of the American aid cannot be replaced, because of the American advanced military technologies. Europe does not have all of the capacities available, but we have also understand that America is a very important global player. And new American administration attitudes are help those who are helping themselves. And I think that if Europe comes up with creative ideas, as like you have mentioned, finally confiscate the assets of the Russian central bank, which is a top priority of my organization and of my work for the last 2 years, that could be a very beneficial offer by Europe towards American partners. Because in case if this money is confiscated, and we are speaking about $300 billion in total, and of them, a bit more than $200 billion are immobilized in the European countries. So if this money is confiscated and put into the new institution, let's say Ukraine Development Bank, which may be located in Brussels, to make sure that European partners and European Central Bank do not feel nervous that we will pull so much money simultaneously at one moment from European jurisdiction and undermine the stability of Eurozone. So, okay, let's keep this money inside Eurozone, but let's have them purely serve for Ukraine. And if this money is reinvested effectively, it can generate up to $20 billion annually, which can be used for procurement of American weapons and make Donald Trump happy, because that would create jobs in the US without, a single penny of the US taxpayers. That could, be used to procure European weapons. I mean, we are very actively using German weapons, French, British, and I think that their producers and their finance ministers and ministers of defense would also be very happy if this is Russian money that is being used for strengthening their own defense industries and contracting the purchase of their own manufactured weapons for Ukraine. But this money can also be used for Ukrainian defense industries, because over the last 3 years, Ukraine has significantly developed certain technologies, like, for example, long-range drones or the electronic warfare, which needs a constant testing and improvement and upgrade from the battlefield dynamics. And, European countries cannot do this because they do not have access to the battlefield. And Ukrainian producers can very quickly do the upgrades because they are getting constant feedback from the front lines. So, using this money for the Ukrainian defense and reconstruction and compensation for victims would basically be win-win-win for everybody.
As you mentioned, you work for quite some time on this topic on frozen Russian assets. You had a lot of meetings, as I mentioned before. So do you see the will in European leaders and in your American partners to make this happen? Because in some of the European countries, some of them, they have some legal things that they can, legal reasons why they can't do this. So do you see the will, and what is the reply, the feedback you get from all of your meetings during this past few years? Because, as I said, you speak so long for this topic, and for this to happen, and for this money to end up in Ukraine.
We in Ukraine say that nothing is impossible. Impossible just takes more time. And we've been on this topic, as you said, almost 2 years very actively. And I remember very well in 2023, our discussions on it always started, it's not going to happen. Let's not waste time discussing this. Let's discuss something more meaningful, what will help Ukraine today. And this is the issue for the post-war, depending how the war ends, blah, blah, blah. But in the meantime, we are seeing that with the small baby steps, this issue is moving forward, because this money has been immobilized in 2022, first days of the full-scale war, by G7 countries. And then the next important step was taken in the beginning of 2024. Basically, that was exactly the year ago in February, when European Union decided to use the windfall profits for Ukraine. And by the end of 2024, the G7 countries did some financial engineering, and they produced the 50 billion loan called Extraordinary Revenues Acceleration Loan, which will be paid off for the next decade, let's say, by the windfall profits on the Russian assets, which means that, and what is very important, that financial markets were not affected by any of this decision, neither by immobilization nor by the decisions on the windfall profits, which means what we'll try to do is ensure that Ukraine doesn't get this money, to keep them as immobilized, as long as immobilized as possible, just in limbo. And yes, our partners are often citing financial and legal constraints, but there was a very strong case prepared by the group of prominent international law experts, not only American, but also European. There were experts from France, from Belgium, from the UK, Germany, and they explained that if this confiscation is done as the countermeasure and will be offset from the future reparations payments, it will be legal, because at this point, Russia has inflicted at Ukraine almost $500 billion damages. And that does not regard the latest attacks on Ukrainian energy system. If we speak about Russian central bank assets, this is $300 billion. So this part, this money, is significantly less than the losses that Russia has already inflicted, meaning that it can absolutely be offset as the reparations as soon as possible. If we speak about financial risks, the issue is that when this confiscation is done by G7 countries, there are no risks to the reserve currencies, because the G7 countries plus Switzerland and Australia in total have almost 95% of all of the global foreign exchange reserves, meaning that there is simply no destination for the reserves of the third countries to flock away in case if this confiscation is done jointly. So we perceive those, arguments more as an excuse than as the real restrictions, probably because some decision makers still see this as the possible bargaining chip to Russia to get them at the negotiations table. But here we have to realize that if this money or part of this money is returned to Russia, this money will be immediately invested into the production of drones, bullets, ammunition, tanks, whatever else that Russia will use for their war machine, for their future conquest against Europe. So we are right now warning Europe strongly against sending Russia money, which will be transformed into the weapons that will highly likely be killing Europeans in the next phases of the Russian imperialistic conquest.
In the end, do you see both presidents, Putin and Zelensky, at the same table? And when do you expect all of this to end in this new atmosphere, global atmosphere, and these new conditions we are all in?
Well, honestly, I have no idea, and I cannot speculate because Russians do not want peace. Russians want whole of Ukraine. They want to subjugate Ukraine. They understand that they cannot do this militarily because they significantly underestimated us. So right now they will try to trick other partners and they will try to trick Ukraine. And therefore, I'm sure and I hope that Ukraine's President Zelensky will have the wisdom to not allow, and European partners and the US, to not allow Russians into tricking all of us, the entire European continent and the free world, into the deal which will eventually grant Russia a lot of time to rearm and restart this war in the nearest future.
Can you see the two presidents at the same table? Because they both strongly denied to talk to each other.
Well, Putin, by the way, is not a legitimate president. You know that the way how he is winning the elections has nothing to do with winning the elections. And I think that it would be, very strong. And he is a war criminal. He is indicted by the International Criminal Court. And, sitting at the negotiations table with a war criminal, of course, is something kind of unacceptable. But it's very hard to predict right now how the situation will evolve. So we will, of course, continue rallying for the support of European partners and to maintain support of Americans, because we are convinced that the only way to the lasting peace is not sitting at the negotiations table with Putin, but defeating Russia in Ukraine and putting Putin behind the bars for this aggression and plenty of other crimes that they have committed.
Ms. Olena, thank you very much for this interview, and I hope next time we talk, this war will be far behind us once and for all. Thank you for your time. Како што слушнавме од разговорот со Олена Халушка, на украинците и многу им се брза да ја завршат оваа војна и дури дел од нив сметаат и дека американското присуство или управување со дел од минералите кои ги поседува, односно кои ги има Украина, може дури Украина и финансиски бенефит да види по завршувањето на оваа војна. Појужно од Украина траат протестите во соседна Србија, студентските протести кои ја разбудија српската јавност и ги извадија и сите граѓани на улица по огромниот масовен протест во Крагуевац. Се уште се случуваат блокади и протести низ цела Србија, а уште еден таков голем протест се подготвува за 1 март, а овој пат, според првичните информации, тој голем протест ќе се одржи во јужниот град, во Ниш, каде се уште досега не дојдоа студентите со едно такво спектакуларно пешачење како што можевме да видиме во прво од Белград до Нови Сад, а подоцна и од Нови Сад и Белград и од Ниш до Крагуевац. Ви благодарам за вниманието со кое не следете, се гледаме повторно идната недела.